We will be starting a bit late, but thank you for coming. It is really a pleasure today to have a speaker about American politics. As you know, myself teaching politics and different classes, either theory of political science or ideology or regime. It is always a blessing, right, to have an American election in the year because it provides us with a lot of examples, a lot of material for our classes. So this is extremely good. This morning again I was showing, we had our commencement last Saturday where our students did a Gangnam style dance, and this morning I was reviewing the Mitt Romney style, which is, if you have the opportunity, watch that. I mean, this is really truly amazing. The Obama style is not as good, I mean, it's not as funny, but the Mitt Romney style, because of course it's a criticism of nouveau riche. Well, in the case of Mitt Romney, it's more old rich, but still, I mean, it's very funny, very interesting. It gives you a lot of hints about American politics. So I won't be too long. So we are really thankful first to the American consulate to bring us Professor Thomas Schaller, who is from the University of Maryland. He's a great commentator of American politics. He's a specialist of American politics. He has columns in different press outlets. He's also publishing in the the liberal journal, American. What is it? American? Oh yeah, there. It's not. Oh yeah, because I changed the bio. American Prospect, right?
Yeah, I used the reference.
Oh, you used the reference. Okay. And so I mean, it's really a pleasure because he's used to engage with also a wider audience, and of course he's very knowledgeable about politics in the U.S. So without further ado, he will review some of the issues regarding the elections coming in November, and that I hope all heard about. I mean, about the American elections going on. At least you should know the main contenders, the main candidates. So without further ado, let's give a big round of applause and welcome to Professor Schaller. And he will have 40 minutes to do his presentation, and then I hope you will engage with him for questions. Don't hesitate to go ahead. This is a unique opportunity. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Schaller.
First of all, thanks to University of St. Joseph and Eric Saturday for welcoming me here. I'm on a 2-week trip through China, including Hong Kong and Macao, which is where I started. And then I head to the mainland tomorrow night. This is my 6th trip this year for the State Department. I've been on sabbatical, so I haven't had teaching obligations. And I started the year in Scandinavia, and then I was in Greece, as I told you earlier, Spain, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. I was in Australia last month, and here I am in China. And for the most part, I really haven't changed my analysis or my predictions about the election since February. It's looking a little closer than I think is comfortable for President Obama. But to give you the sort of last slide first, I'll cut to the chase and let you know that I think Obama will win the election. I think he will win it by a smaller margin than his original election 4 years ago of 7 points over John McCain. So he will return to office with less of an electoral margin or mandate than he did initially. I think the Republicans will hold the House, probably by a smaller margin, and the Democrats will hold the Senate, probably by a smaller margin. And so we'll have all 3 leaders, John Boehner, the Speaker, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and President Obama returning to office with the same power structure as status quo ante, the same control of the government, divided control that is, but with all of those officers coming back with less of a mandate than they initially went into the election in November. To give you a sense of how I got there, and what I think the election portends next November, this coming November, November 6th, let's back up a little bit and just do a brief review of the election results from 2008 as a starting point, and show you the map from 2008, and then we'll move forward. The 2008 election, I told my students, I teach undergraduates just like you guys, that not all the elections are going to be this exciting. 2008 was a really uniquely path-breaking election for a variety of reasons. It was the first election in about 50 years where we didn't have an incumbent president running for re-election or an incumbent vice president seeking to become president. So there was a wide open primary on both the Republican side and the Democratic side with no real heir apparent on either party's primary process for the first time since the 1952 election. And it was a very exciting primary season. The Republican primary between Mitt Romney and John McCain and Mike Huckabee and others was interesting. And then certainly the primary on the Democratic side between Hillary Clinton, potentially the first woman presidential major party nominee, and Barack Obama, potentially the first non-white major party nominee, was this epic fight that went on for 4 or 5 months until Obama finally beat Hillary Clinton, and she ended her campaign in May of 2008. So it was a tough fight for Obama in the primary, and then an easier fight. Obama really had most of the advantages. There was a high level of Bush fatigue. Bush's approval ratings were very low. The country was ready for a change after 8 years of the Bush administration. I think Hillary Clinton, had she won the nomination 4 years ago, she would have won the presidency as well. It was really a cycle for the Democrats to win. And Obama did win it. He beat McCain, as I said, by about 7 points nationally. And he got 28 states out of 50 and 360 electoral votes. For those of you not familiar with our electoral system, it's a national vote in the sense that everybody in the country is eligible to cast a popular vote. But the votes in our federal system are aggregated on a statewide basis. And some of you, not all of you, but some of you are too young to remember 12 years ago, the George W. Bush-Al Gore election of 2000. Bush won the popular vote, Bush lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote because he had his votes in the right combination of states, because it's a series of 50 statewide contests. And that's important to remember as we move into the map. You have to get your votes in the right combination of states to win electoral votes, and specifically a majority of the electoral votes. There's 538 total electors, each state having a number of electors in the vote for president equal to its numbers of legislators in the National Congress. So just to take an example, I teach in Maryland. I live in Washington and teach in the state next to Washington, D.C., Maryland. They have 8 House members and 2 senators. Every state has 2 senators in the upper chamber. So you add 8 and 2 and you have 10 electoral votes, okay? So McCain carried 22 states, Obama carried 28 states, and when you add up the electoral votes from those states, he had 365, which is 95 more than the 270, which is a majority. 538 divided by 2 is 269, that's half. You need 1 more than half to win. So Obama got to a surplus, if you will, of 95 electoral votes, which by long-term historical standards isn't a big margin, but in recent presidential history is a pretty significant margin. Just as a point of reference, Bush won his first election against Gore almost as narrowly as you can. He got 271 electoral votes, just 1 extra. And in his re-election, George Bush got 286 electoral votes. So Bush barely won twice. By that standard, Obama had a pretty comfortable victory. Although, as I already told you, I'm predicting Obama will win, but with fewer electoral votes than the 365. Obama set every campaign record known to man, or at least in American politics, for fundraising. George Bush got contributions from about 700,000 different Americans in 2004 when he got reelected. Obama got to 1 million, and then 2, and then 3, and 3+ million individuals gave him at least $1, setting the record by 4 times what Bush had set it 4 years earlier. So it was a record-breaking campaign. And then, perhaps most significantly, we had a high voter turnout, not a record, but a modern record. And the turnout was different. The electorate, for the first time in American history, was 1/4 non-white. And it's fitting, I suppose, that in the first election of a non-white presidential candidate in the United States, that 1 out of 4 voters was either Latino, African American, or Asian American. Oh, I have to click. All right, so here's the map from 2008. Now, as a shorthand, unless you're a regular TV junkie and you already know this, in American politics, on the media, the depictions are very simple for the 2 parties, and there's an easy way to remember it. The Republicans are in red, are red Republican. That's how you remember it, right? And the Democrats are in blue. So here are the states in the 2008 Final Electoral Map. And you can see Obama's total of 365 electoral votes, and you can see McCain's total of 173. That adds up to 538. Again, 270 or above. John Kerry, for example, when he lost to Bush, Bush got 286, so Kerry got the balance, 252. Kerry came very close to winning the presidency, 252, just shy of 270. Obama carried every state that John Kerry won in 2004, 4 years before that. John Kerry carried 19 states, Obama carried 28. He carried all 19 that John Kerry won, and 9 more. And where are those 9 states? And they're essentially 3 groups of 3 states each in 3 different regions. 3 states in the Southwest, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico. In the back, you may not be able to see the abbreviations, but you'll just have to take my word for it. Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico for about 20 electoral votes. Obama picked up 3 states in his home region, the Midwest. You can see Illinois is not one of them, but that's where Chicago is. He picked up Iowa to the west of Illinois, and Indiana and Ohio east of it for about 30 electoral votes. And then he picked up 3 states in the South, Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida for about 55 electoral votes. In other words, if you looked at the map from 2004, it looked just like this, except those 9 states were red instead of blue. And that's the difference between John Kerry becoming 44th President of the United States in 2004, which didn't happen, and Barack Obama, in fact, becoming the 44th President in 2008. Just 9 states is the difference in the election, okay? And so that gives Obama the difference between 252 for Kerry and 365 for Obama and the victory. You can see that Obama can afford to lose some of those states in his re-election and still win. He doesn't have to win all 9 of them. Some of those states have 5 electoral votes, some of them have 20 electoral votes. He can afford to lose some of those states to Mitt Romney and still win the presidency. By the way, my students interrupt me all the time, so if I say something or give a term, electoral college, and you're not sure what I'm talking about, just shove your fist in the air and I will take your questions, no problem, okay? You can interrupt me in the middle of the speech, it's not a problem. All right, so there's your electoral map from 4 years ago. Now, looking at the voters, how the voters voted, I'll move around a little bit so you folks can see too. If you look at the demographic groups, we have a very clear pattern that started around 1992 when Clinton got elected in terms of what blue Democratic America looks like and what red Republican America looks like. So these patterns aren't just specific to the Obama-McCain result. These are patterns that have been developing really for the last 4, 5, 6 presidential elections over the last 20 or 25 years. But it's a good example of the differences in the voting behaviors of American voters based on their demographic characteristics. So let's take a few of these. I'm not going to run through every statistic here, and if you're in the back, you may not be able to see the numbers, so you'll just have to take it on faith here. But between Obama and McCain, essentially this is the exit poll, so there's some margin of error. So this is an estimate. This is an exit poll that's a consortium of the media pays interviewers to interview people as they're leaving the poll. So it's not an exact estimate. It's just a sampled estimate, but it's relatively accurate within 2 or 3 points margin of error. Obama and McCain split the male vote, but you can see Obama dominated among the female vote. He won it by 13 points, and that's really the difference. Especially when you consider that in America, women cast more votes than men do. Women were about 53% of the voters, and men were only 47% of the voters. So Obama got 56% of the 53% of the electorate that's female. That's a big head start in terms of winning the election. On race and ethnicity, no surprise here. McCain won white voters, but Obama won all the non-white voting groups. He won African Americans that were about 13% of the electorate, 95-5. He won them 19-to-1 ratio. He won Latino voters, who were about 9% of the electorate. He won them basically 2-to-1, 67-33. And he won Asian Americans, which is a kind of a broad category that includes people from a variety of ethnicities and national backgrounds. He won them about 5-3, 62%. They're about 4% of the electorate, even though Asian Americans are now growing at a faster rate than Latinos are. For the first time in American history. Latinos are still the largest ethnic minority. They're about 15% of the population. African Americans are about 12% of the population. But African Americans cast more votes because they're an older and more registered population and because Obama was on the ballot. So African Americans were 12% of the population and 13% of the electorate. And Latino Americans were about 14% of the electorate, but only 9% of the voters, 14% of the citizenry, because they're younger and fewer of them are citizens. Many of them are not naturalized citizens. So eventually Latinos, which have caught African Americans in terms of residents, in terms of Americans, will eventually catch African Americans in terms of the share of voters. So for the moment, African Americans are still the leading non-white ethnic minority at the ballot box, but Latinos are the biggest non-white ethnic minority in terms of total people, total Americans, and soon they will catch African Americans. And at some point, Asian Americans may catch African Americans as well, but I think we're several decades from that. But there's a significant growth. In fact, for the first time in 35 years, Latino immigrants were not the most populous immigrants in the country last year. This was just reported by the Census Bureau. Asian Americans were about 470,000 immigrants, legal immigrants last year, and Latino Americans, mostly Mexican and Puerto Rican Americans, were only 380,000. So for the first time in 35 years, Latino Americans fell second in terms of legal immigrants to the country in 2010 or 2000, I guess it's the 2011 data, behind Asian Americans. Asian Americans, by the way, there's differences there in terms of nationality and ethnicity. South Asians, Indians, and Pakistanis tend to vote more Democratic than, say, Vietnamese do, or Thais, who vote a little bit more Republican. In terms of age, a very clear pattern. You can see there, as you get older, as you move down in the age category, the older you get, the more Republican your vote. Obama dominated among voters under 30, 2-1. He and McCain basically split middle-aged voters between 30 and 60, and McCain won senior citizens. And that kind of makes sense, much like the white-black, right? McCain was 72, Obama was 47. They were 25 years apart in age. That's the biggest age difference between two presidential candidates in the history of American politics, okay? Skip down to religion, you can see the Protestant vote, McCain won that, but Obama won the Catholic vote and the Jewish vote. The Jewish vote is very small, it's only 2 or 3%. Catholics are the really interesting category here because every presidential candidate from 1972 to 2008 also carried the Catholic vote. It's a good bellwether of your overall competitiveness in presidential elections. And notice that the Catholic vote today is browner, right? There's more Latino Catholics, there's more Hispanic Catholics, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Rican Americans. So that the ability to carry Catholics today is also implies the ability to carry Latinos today. The Catholic vote has become more Hispanic. About 2/3 of American Latinos are Catholic and 1/3 of them are Protestant. Protestant Latinos vote more Republican and Catholic Latinos vote more Democratic. Lastly, I showed you the geography in the previous map. Let me just go back. I forgot this point. You can see the Democrats dominate sort of the coastal regions of the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast, whereas the Republican Party tends to be a stronger party statewide, that is, in the geographic heartland, starting in the mountain states and down through the breadbasket and into the deep south. So you have this sort of flyover America, as they call it, the middle of America is more Republican, and the coastal cities, the Seattle, Portland, LA, San Francisco, San Diego on the West Coast, and Boston and New York and Philly and DC, Atlanta are more liberal on the East Coast, right? But that's just looking at it statewide. When you look at it within the states, you can see, sure enough, the closer you are to a more dense city, the bigger and larger and more dense the city, the better Obama does. So big cities, he wins 70-30. And then he wins a majority in the small cities. They split the vote in the suburbs. And then as you move to rural and urban, rural and small towns, that's where McCain wins. So when you put all this together, when you put this composite picture together, you have two parties with two different coalitions. The Democratic Blue American, again, I put Obama / the Democrats. This is not unique to 2008. This has been building over time. This coalition was similar for Bush and Kerry, or Gore and Bush, right? The differences may be here and there. Bush did a little better with Latinos. The vote shares changed a little bit, but this is an overall picture that has been building for about 20 years now. You have the Democratic coalition, which is younger, it's female-led, it's more multiracial across all ethnic identities, it's more coastal in terms of states, and it's more concentrated in urban, densely populated areas, and Obama did better among independents and moderates. Whereas McCain and the Republican coalition is just the complement to that, the remainder, if you will. It's older, more male voters, mostly white, more rural and suburban, and in the heartland states, with McCain doing not as well with moderates and independents, and that's the difference in sort of your Blue America coalition versus your Red America coalition. Now, what's interesting about the map, let's go back to this map for just a second. What's interesting about this map, I told you already, only 9 states changed between the 2004 and the 2008 election, these 9 states here. Only 3 states changed between the 2000 election of Bush-Gore and the 2004 re-election of Bush over Kerry. And 2 of those 3 states, New Mexico and Iowa, are already on this map. The only one that you don't see here on the 2000 to 2004 change is New Hampshire, which is right here. And what does that mean? That means in the last 3 elections, 2000, 2004, and 2008, 40 of the 50 states, every state on this map, except for the 9 here in New Hampshire, voted either Bush, McCain, or they voted Gore, Kerry, and Obama. The 40 states, those 40 states for the most part, they change a little bit, are pretty predictable. We know, even before the Republicans nominate Mitt Romney, that there are certain states that he's going to win no matter what, and there are certain states that Obama's going to win no matter what. I mean, the Republicans could have nominated me, and you'd know that I'm going to win Utah, the most Republican state in the Union in the last 3 elections. And certainly Romney's going to win Utah because it's the most Mormon state in America. And then one of the more liberal areas, I live in Washington, D.C., that was Obama's biggest margin except for Hawaii, his home state. The Democrats could nominate me and I could win Ohio and the District of Columbia. And because about 40 of the states are already known, and because those 40 states are kind of evenly divided, the Democrats have a little bit of an advantage in those 40 states, but basically Mitt Romney was going to start with 180 electoral votes on the way to 270 no matter what. There's no electoral scenario where Mitt Romney gets below 180 electoral votes, and there's no electoral scenario where Barack Obama gets below 180 electoral votes. And since the threshold to win is 270, it's really a fight for those last 90 electors. That's it. The whole race boils down to a fight over 8-10 states, and not even all the voters in those states. These states, we call them purple states because they're halfway red and halfway blue. But they're not purple because Virginia is full of a bunch of undecided voters. Even in Virginia, 45% of the people are Democrats and 45% of the people are Republicans. It's just that 10% of it, it's just that they're evenly divided. And so a national election that's going to happen in 3 weeks from today, right? 3 weeks from today. 130 million people will cast their votes, but the 2 candidates in these last few weeks will spend almost all of their resources. Campaign ads, radio ads, volunteers, paid staffers, phone calls, door knocks, leaflets, events will be concentrated on about 10% of the voters in these 10 states. And that's it. About 8 or 9 million voters will decide the election of 130 million people. Now, because we have so few swing states, right, these candidates are going to have to focus on those states, and the electoral map is very narrow. That's why we've been having these very close elections. That's what I said. Bush 271, 286, just barely over the threshold. Obama's victory now looks like a landslide, 365 electoral votes and 7 points, but I think it's going to come back down. He's going to win this election by 2 or 3 points and maybe 300 or 310 electoral votes, and he could, in theory, lose it because Romney, again, is already starting with 108 electoral votes. It makes the elections very predictable when you already know the outcome of 40 of the 50 states. Are you following my point? This was a cartoon in the Washington Post, where I live, D.C., by the Pulitzer-winning cartoonist Tom Tolles. And if you look in the corner, and some of you won't be able to see this in the back, the date on this cartoon is 10/2004, October 2004. It was a cartoon put out right before the Bush-Kerry re-election race in 2004. And the caption says here, if you can't see it in the back because it's kind of low, it says, "The country where every vote counts are the undecided states," not the United States of America, the undecided states, these states that are kind of half Republican and half Democrat. Now, if you notice on this map, there's 3, 7, there's about 10 states in there. This is a map this cartoon is 8 years old. This is not me failing to update my PowerPoint. I left it in for a reason. This cartoon is 8 years old, and it's got about 10 states in it. And not only that, almost all those 10 states are the same 10 states I just showed you. So it's not just that we only have 40 of the 50 states that are already out of play, and the election is down to 10 states. It's more or less the same 10 states that they have been for the last decade. Right? We're still fighting over Florida and Ohio and Iowa and the southwestern states. You know, Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota become a little bit more Democratic, Pennsylvania, but maybe add in Indiana here, maybe add in New Hampshire. So some of the states become a little bit, they start to tilt one way or the other over time, but you see basically it's the same usual suspects, the same handful of states. There's not 40 states in this map, and it's not 10 different states in this map today than 8 years ago. It's basically the same 7, 8, 10, 12 states. That's how stable our electoral politics on the presidential level are right now. All right, here's your 2 tickets. Seems to be a lot of pointing with the Democrats. Obama and Biden, of course, I think knew they were going to be the nominees unless there was some kind of scandal, so we knew who the Democrats were going to nominate. And I would suggest to you that we knew that Mitt Romney, at the very least, we didn't know who the vice presidential selection would be, but we knew, I think, a pretty strong sense of confidence that Mitt Romney was going to be the Republican nominee. Now, why would I say that? A couple of reasons. First of all, Mitt Romney ran for president last time, and he basically never stopped running. And there's a history here in the Republican Party. In the Republican Party, with the exception of George W. Bush, in the last 40 years, the only Republican to run and win the nomination his first try was George W. Bush. Every other Republican, Ronald Reagan, ran twice and lost before he finally became the nominee in 1980. He beat George Bush Sr. that year, who later became the nominee in 1988. He beat Bob Dole that year, who 8 years later became the nominee in 1996. You see where I'm going here? John McCain lost to George W. Bush in 2000, and 8 years later he became the nominee in 2008. And guess who he beat that year and finished second? Mitt Romney. So there's a history in the Republican Party of you got to run one time, learn how to be a candidate, let the voters kick the tires a little bit on you, to use a metaphor maybe unfamiliar to you, learn how to debate, make connections with donors, get your name out there, spend some time in Iowa, New Hampshire, in the early primary states, and lose. And then come back and maybe, not everybody who runs twice wins, but some subset of the people who try again eventually win. And there was really only two candidates running again. One was Ron Paul, who I would argue is outside of the mainstream of Republican philosophy, particularly on defense and foreign policy, and Mitt Romney. So if you had no other piece of information than that, you would predict Mitt Romney would be the winner. Secondly, Mitt Romney was never really above 20, 25, or 30% of the polls. It wasn't like a majority of Republicans liked him. But he was always the leader with a plurality of vote. And so we saw Michelle Bachmann rose up in August of 2011, and she caught him in the polls for about a week, and then she faded away. And then Rick Perry announced his candidacy, and he turned out to be a terrible debater, and he faded away. And then Herman Cain, the pizza maker, the African-American businessman, he caught Romney in the polls for about 72 hours, and then a bunch of scandals took him down. And then it was Gingrich's turn after the South Carolina and Georgia primaries, and he made a late run at Gingrich. And then finally Rick Santorum, the sort of moral candidate who had a lot of the evangelical support, and the social conservatives, he made a late run and they all faded. Romney was always in the lead overall in the polls. He was always the best finance candidate. He always had the best campaign advisors and machine and field campaign, and he had run 4 years ago and knew how to do the debates. And his job was to just not lose. His job was to not lose it. He was the favorite. It was his race to lose, and his job was to not trip up, make any mistakes, let the other candidates fall aside, and that's exactly what happened. Last piece of evidence. I'm on the email list for the Republicans and John Boehner in the House, and the Republican Committee, and the Democratic National Committee in the White House. And the Democratic National Committee, which is basically the White House, right? They run the Democratic Party when the Democrat's the president. They send out daily emails every day about a whole bunch of stuff. And they started sending out anti-Romney emails about 2 years ago. And even when Michelle Bachmann or Rick Perry or Herman Cain had their moment in the sun, they just kept hammering emails, sometimes 2, 3, or 10 a day about Romney. So the Obama White House, no fools politically, they believed 2 years ago that they would run against Romney, and of course they were right. So I think we knew who the tickets were going to be. Sorry about that. Okay, so will Obama win re-election? And I frame it that way for a reason. I didn't frame it as will Obama beat Romney or can Romney beat Obama? Because I think at any time you have an incumbent, whether it's a congresswoman or a governor or a mayor or a dog catcher, and they're running for re-election, you have to start the conversation with the current holder of that office. And indeed, if you think about any time an incumbent is running for office, for re-election, the question you ask about her is, are you happy with the job she's doing? In the case of the president, historically, that's a he question, of course, but does the nation approve of an incumbent president who's running for re-election? Are they happy with the guy they've got in office right now? It's really a two-stage sort of decision tree, okay? Now, if the country is happy with the current president, if the answer to that, I don't mean by a small margin like 52-48, I mean 60% of the country is happy with the incumbent, it doesn't really matter in the second stage of this decision who the alternative is, right? So think of Ronald Reagan in 1984. He won 49 of the 50 states, an unfathomable outcome today. There is no scenario in which Obama or Mitt Romney wins 40. Mitt Romney can be caught sleeping with, as they say in American politics, a live girl or a dead boy, and he'd still win at least 15 states, right? There's just no scenario in which Romney doesn't get 170, 180 electoral votes. There's no way Obama wins 49 states. But that's what happened with Ronald Reagan in 1984, right? Who ran against? Who did he beat that year? Nobody can even remember Walter Mondale, the senator from Minnesota, who only carried his home state. So it doesn't really matter who the other party is offering. Gary Hart or some of the other Democrats could have run against Reagan, and Reagan still would have won because the country was happy with Reagan. The more interesting cases is when half or less of the country is happy with the incumbent. Again, this is true not just of presidential politics. Then you have to really start to look at the alternative. If the country is not sold on the incumbent, then you have to say, well, what about the alternative? And there are situations where you say, look, the other party, their guy, their platform and ideas are preferable. So think of Bill Clinton in 1992. Bush Sr. was the incumbent at the time. His popularity at one point and his job approval was 90% after the Gulf War in early 1991, but by election year it had fallen into the 30s because of the economy and a recession. And people said, this was a good president to marshal the country through the end of the Cold War, but now we want to start looking at home, and we've got this young governor who's talking about the economy and healthcare and jobs. And sure enough of the country was convinced that the alternative was suitable, and Bush lost re-election in 1992. Of course, sometimes the country may not be sold on a current president, and he can still win. George W. Bush, when he went into re-election, his approval rating was only 3 points higher than his disapproval rating. In other words, he was +3 in net approval. You follow what I'm saying? 3% more people liked the overall job he was doing than disliked the job he was doing. And guess what he won by? 2.5 points. That's basically what he won by. And how did he manage to do that? Because the Bush campaign, very smartly, made the alternative look worse. They said John Kerry is weak, you can't trust him on security, he flip-flopped on the Iraq War, he's soft, he's weak. And in fact, in the Bush campaign, they ran 75% of their television ads were about vote for Bush, they were negative ads against Kerry. And 90% of their television ads in the last month were negative ads against the Democrats and Kerry. When you're an incumbent president and you're in trouble, you don't run for yourself, you get people to vote against the alternative. This is the scenario we're in right now, right? We are in a no scenario. I'm going to demonstrate to this in just a minute. We are clearly down this path because Obama's approval ratings are not 60-40. You're going to see they're about 50-50 here in a second. So the real question is, are we going to have a change election? This is what Mitt Romney wants. He wants a change. Or are we going to have a choice election, which is what Obama's trying to say. You have to choose between Romney. But right now, I can tell you, and I was predicting this all year, you'll just have to take it on faith, that we would have a very negative election. Because the challenger has to make the case that the incumbent is failing. And if the incumbent is in trouble, he has to make the case that the challenger is unworthy of substitution, right? And sure enough, this week, yesterday morning, International Herald Tribune, New York Times piece citing research from my colleague, John Geer, who teaches at Vanderbilt. He had, all the ads aren't out yet. He's analyzed the ads so far. 80% of Obama's ads are negative ads against Romney. 80% higher than Bush, right? 84% of Romney's ads are negative ads against Obama. It makes perfect strategic logical sense. All right, so what is Obama's approval? Here's Obama's Gallup approval. It's a 3-day average, right? They take the polls every day, like they're taking the polls right now on Tuesday. When they get them, it'll be Friday, Monday, Tuesday, and then when they get the Wednesday polls, they'll throw the Friday numbers out and make it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You follow me? This is a rolling 3-day average. And you can see Obama for the better part of the year has basically been, the election year, he's been dead even. He was net negative in approval. The worst of his presidency was in August and September of 2011, a little over a year ago. This was in the wake of the debt ceiling crisis, which, if you're following, a fight over whether the government was going to pay its bills and increase the amount of debt that the government could borrow to pay for its deficits. And Obama and the Congress had very low ratings, and the president slowly, by the start of the year, the economy started to improve in the last quarter of 2011 and the first quarter of 2012. The stock market went up about 60% in those 6 months, the last 3 months of 2011 and the first 3 months. And he moved back within basically break even, and then he's more or less been break even since then. The only variation here that's become a little more volatility is because of the conventions. Here you can see he went negative after the Republicans convention. He kicked up a little bit after the Democratic convention. He kicked up again a little bit after the 47% video got leaked about Romney. And then since the debate, he's back down to break even. So there's Obama's approval. It's more than within the margin of error. Basically, of people polled, there's always 4 or 5% who say, I don't know or have no opinion. But of the people polled, half of them like the job Obama's is doing, and half of them don't. That's a president who could lose re-election. Do you see that? Now that number, that's overall, right? That's overall. They just ask you, do you approve? This is not personal approval. The president's personal approval is high, and the president's wife's approval is even higher. And if you've listened to Romney in the last year, particularly back during the debates, and he still says this, a lot of his sentences start like this. I think the president's a decent fellow. Or I like the president, he's a nice guy. I think the president is a good American who loves his family. Comma, pause. But he doesn't know what he's doing, or he's never been in the private sector, he doesn't know how to create jobs, or he's failed to deliver on his promises to return the economy. Because the Romney people can read the polls and do the interest focus groups just like Obama people and the pollsters can do, and they know that if you attack the president on personal stuff, attacking his birth certificate or calling him a Muslim or attacking him on a personal level, that will backfire. Romney always cushions his critiques as a policy critique and a competence critique. Listen for that, he needs to pick, right? So that's what you hear from Romney because he knows about that. Now this is overall job approval, and it's really the function of two numbers. One is the president's approval on the economy, which is always the most important issue in almost every presidential election except for 1972 at the end of the Vietnam War and 2004, the first election after the September 11 attacks. You can see, now here disapproval is in red, like in the red, right? And approval is in the black. And when presidents first come to office, this is from the start of the Obama administration, when presidents first come into office, people approve and nobody disapproves because he hasn't done anything. It's called the honeymoon period. But after a few months, it sort of settles into a range. And by the 9th month, you can see those two axes crossing, right? The dots are all the data samples, all the polling samples. And basically, from the 9th month of Barack Obama's presidency, from the fall of 2009 until today, he has been net negative on economic approval for 3 years. And at some point, and again, this is that same point, you notice this is August, you can see July and October, you can't see the years, this is 2011. In the end of summer 2011, he was net negative 22, 23, 24 points on the economy. That's a president who's going to lose re-election. But you can see the economy got a little bit better in late 2011 and early 2012, the GDP growth rates, the monthly job number rates, and Obama's brought it back into a range. And in fact, he's as close to break even as he's been since month 9 of his presidency. And that now overall, the overall aggregate of the polls, Obama's about 4 or 5 points net negative on the economy. Meanwhile, he's about the same distance positive on foreign policy. Obama's about 4, 5, 6 point net positive. You see there's fewer data points here. They don't ask this question as much in polls. But we have enough data to conclude. And you can see Obama's been net positive on foreign policy since the beginning of his presidency. And that's largely built out of ending the Iraq War, which is approved by about 3/4 of Americans, killing Osama bin Laden, the way he handled Libya and so forth. The president's use of drone missiles is unpopular with liberals, but very popular with the country. And so the president is net positive on the foreign policy. The problem here is that people weigh this more. In most election cycles, when you ask people what is motivating their vote, they mention the economy at much higher rates than this. So this doesn't really cancel out perfectly for Obama. He'd much rather be net positive on the economy and net negative on foreign policy. Okay. Let's condition his economic numbers by two things, however. First of all, depending on who you are in America, you view these numbers very differently. I'm going to take my jacket off, it's a little warm. Okay. If you looked at the polls back at the top of that debt crisis, right? At the top of the debt crisis in August, at the peak, excuse me, of the debt crisis in August 2011, the debt ceiling crisis. The country, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all had the same view of the economy. The economy, the stimulus had ended, the economy was starting to drag, they were hearing bad news. This poll question asked, are you hearing mostly bad or positive news about the economy? And so it didn't matter, Republican, Independents, and moderates or Democrats, all were reporting the same thing. But in the last year, that's changed, right? Republicans, Democrats, and Independents were all starting to hear good news in the winter, and then as we move closer to the election, and this is a function sometimes of people follow, Republicans watch Fox News, and Democrats watch MSNBC, and Republicans subscribe to conservative magazines, and liberals subscribe Democrats to liberal magazines. You can see this bifurcation began again, this distance. And now you have Republicans coming back to where they were, saying the economy's not in great shape, but Democrats having a positive view of the economy. But what really matters here, notice, is that independence, right? Republicans will return back to where they were. Democrats have returned to the president and the notion that the economy is turning around. And independents, for the most part, are with the Democrats on this. And so that's a bit of a qualifier or a buffer on these numbers, right? Even though the president's net negative, the people he needs to be positive about him, the independents who will swing the election are coming around to his view. And here's the other major qualifier. This is a poll question. They've taken this question, Gallup, as recently as a few months ago in the summer. Here is the percentage of people that says, how much are George Bush and Obama to blame for the economy? Thinking about the economic problems. How much do you blame Bush or Obama for these? A great deal or a moderate amount? And the percentage of people who say a great deal or moderate amount, and it sums to more than 100, so some people could say both. Some people could say a great deal for Bush and a great deal for Obama. But the percentages of people who blame Bush for the economy today, more than 3 years after he left office, is still higher than blame Obama. So some of Obama's negative approval is conditioned by, or mitigated by a bit, the fact that there's still Bush blaming going on. All right, let's talk about some key developments and issues, and then I'll make my predictions and I'll take your questions. How are we doing on time, Eric?
It's fine for now. Good.
Fine for now? Okay. The key developments in the election. We have a monthly job data that comes out on the first Friday of every month. There'll be one more before the election. I think at this point that won't matter. The last monthly job number was pretty good, and the unemployment actually ticked under 8% for the first time. The quarterly growth data was not very good for Obama in the second and third quarters of this year, but it was good in the first quarter and the fourth quarter of last year. So he's, again, vulnerable, but not, those numbers have not been entirely destructive of his reelection. The key events on the foreign policy, as I already mentioned, are Obama's decision to end and bring the military, not all Americans, but the military presence out of Iraq, and the killing of Osama bin Laden back a year ago, May. Romney's 47% comments, if you follow this in the news, I can't retell the whole story, but Romney, with some rich donors, was basically talking about how half of the country will vote for Obama because they are lazy and dependent on government and they don't take responsibility for their lives. A really devastating leaked video that hurt Romney a little bit. And then the convention bumps. The Republicans got about a 2-point bump out of their convention net. The Democrats did a little better. Most people agree they had a better and smoother convention, and Michelle Obama and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama did better in terms of their speeches and the sort of pageantry and the stagecraft of the Democratic convention. And so the Democrats were really looked at Obama was gaining really strong ground in September with the 47% video leaking and the convention bounce, and then Obama just pretty much eliminated all of that advantage that he built up over the month of September with his horrific debate performance back on October 3rd. And he, of course, is going to be debating tonight and tomorrow morning here in Macao at 9 a.m. I would encourage you to watch that. The leaked story is already out. The talking points from the Democrats is that you'll see a feistier, more aggressive Obama. He looked very passive, and he let Romney sort of run over him. Romney did a really good job in that debate, and some polls drew even and even is ahead of Obama. I think it's a temporary bounce. I think, again, Obama will end up winning this thing, but I wouldn't say that if Obama has another bad debate performance. If Obama puts 2 back-to-back bad debate performances, he could be in trouble. In terms of the issues, the state of the economy is number 1. Tax policy has been discussed a lot in terms of the top 1% and the bottom 99% and the structure of our tax code and the winners and losers that are created by tax policy. Deficits and debt and austerity, the U.S. went a little different route from Europe with a stimulus as opposed to austerity. It looks like Obama is being validated in that decision. Our economy is not growing fast, but it's growing faster than many of the European economies that opted for deficits instead of deficit reduction instead of stimulus. Wall Street and the auto bailouts and the stimulus, Obama. First of all, there was a Bush stimulus package in 2008, which nobody really complained about on the right and conservatives, and then there was an Obama stimulus passed in February of 2009 after he was in office about a month. And the Wall Street bailout was passed in between. It was passed in October, November of 2008 when Bush was still president and Obama was president-elect, basically. And Obama agreed with that. So Obama sort of has the auto bailout, the Wall Street bailout and stimulus on his record, and you hear Romney and Ryan talking about we bailed out all Wall Street and the car companies and we spent $800 billion for stimulus and it hasn't fixed the economy. And so that's an anchor around Obama's neck. Foreign policy and military front, the nuclear Iran question, the Libya attacks recently, and the Benghazi attacks, and the killing of 4 American State Department personnel. Trade with and borrowing from China. You've heard Romney talk a little bit about our debt and the debt holding of China and GDP growth in China, and the sort of, I wouldn't call it I wouldn't call it fear-mongering, but kind of a light xenophobia that is building a little bit among the American populace, and I can talk about that in the question and answer. And then there has been some talk that abortion and gay marriage, these cultural issues that really weren't part of the 2008 election. I mean, 2008, because of the state of the economy and worries about terrorism and the Iraq war was still going on, it was the first election where we pundits like me said, look, notice how we're not talking about contraception and abortion and gay marriage and political correctness and guns, these social and cultural and religious issues, because the country's got much more bigger problems. But abortion and gay marriage started to emerge as important issues, and what's interesting there is that the Democrats at their convention were proudly touting their support of reproductive choice, proudly touting the fact that Obama came out for gay marriage last year. They believe now that these wedge issues, that these cultural, social issues that used to work against Democratic presidential candidates, abortion, gay marriage, gay rights, are now working for the Democrats because the younger generation is much more progressive and liberal on these issues, and as their parents and grandparents die off and are replaced by younger generations, we know a majority of Americans under 40, even under 50, support gay marriage. And so these issues now, Democrats feel confident to run on them instead of run from them. Now, what favors each ticket? Let's talk about Obama and Biden. First, the incumbency advantage. Obama's an incumbent president, and knowing that, 2 years ago, you've got a 2-to-1 chance that he's going to win. Why? Because from the time of George Washington to the time of George Bush, incumbent presidents have won 2/3 of the time in American history. And in fact, it's even a higher rate since the Second World War. More current elections, obviously, are more relevant. Since the Second World War, there have been 10 presidents to run for re-election. 7 of those 10 won. The only 3 who lost, Gerald Ford in 1976, Jimmy Carter in 1980, and George Bush Sr. in 1992, all had serious challenges within their own party when they were seeking renomination for president. The other 7 presidents who ran for re-election were unchallenged in their party, all won re-election, 7 for 7 since the Second World War. Obama's run for re-election. He wasn't challenged by any serious, there's always some crazy write-in people that declare, I'm talking about a serious contender. Jimmy Carter was challenged by Ted Kennedy in 1980, right? Obama was unchallenged in his renomination. There was no internal party dissension or challengers. If he loses in 3 weeks, he'll be the first president since the Second War to run for re-election unopposed in his party and lose. All right? Now, patterns do end at some point, so maybe he will be the first. Patterns don't last forever, but it would break a historical pattern. Incumbents win for a variety of reasons. The demography of the country favors Obama. The groups that the Democrats win, with the exception of union households and family, which are shrinking, and senior citizens who are becoming a higher share as the population life expectancy increases, with the exception of older voters and union families and households. Democrats win a majority of votes from almost every group that's expanding. They win among unmarried voters, and we are an unmarried majority country now. A majority of women in the country are unmarried, and almost the majority of men are. They win among non-white voters who are expanding as a share of the electorate. They win among women voters who are a majority of the electorate, and so on and so forth. So the demographic changes in the country tend to help Obama. Bush blaming is still very real. I just pointed that out to you. That favors Obama. The foreign policy and culture war edge, which I just talked about, Obama's net positive on foreign policy. For the last 40 years, whatever you think of Republicans and preemptive war and the Iraq invasion, but for the last 40 years, and really up until Bush destroyed the reputation of the Republican Party, I'm not saying this is an opinion, I'm saying this is an empirical fact from polls. For 40 years, from the end of Eisenhower, and certainly from the end of the Johnson era, through Nixon and Reagan and Bush, when polled, Americans said they trusted the Republican Party, generally speaking, over the Democratic Party. They often refer to the Republicans, this is a very gender normative, these are not my terms, as the daddy party, on defense, strong, security. And, conversely, the Democrats, for 40 years, go up and down a little bit, when asked who you trust more on domestic, economic, women, welfare, education, environment, Democrats were always polled as the more trusted mommy party, right? Well, now you have a president who's net negative on the economy and net positive on foreign policy, and it used to be the Republicans that would use guns and religion and abortion and gay rights to drive a wedge in the Democratic coalition. Now you have the Democrats running toward those issues instead of running away from those issues, and so we've had a changing of the wardrobe. We have cross-dressing now. We have the Democrats running as the daddy culture war party, and we have the Republicans saying economy, 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 and running as the mommy party, and the welfare reform, and the Social Security and Medicare reform party. It's very interesting here. It's a kind of a topsy-turvy cross-dressing situation. Lastly, the stability of the electoral map. Remember, Obama won 28 states. He doesn't even have to win all of those. Romney's got to move states away from Obama. Obama just has to defend his map. He doesn't have to pick up states. He had to pick up states over Kerry, but he doesn't have to pick up any new states, and he can afford to lose back some states and still be president. And the more stable the map is, the less loose it is, the harder it is to shake states free. If the map was loose and all the states were in play, that wouldn't favor Obama, right? What favors Romney and Ryan? Economy, economy, economy. It's always, almost every year, the most important issue, and it's where it's the president's, and it's a big Achilles heel. It's his one weakness, but it's like the Death Star in Star Wars, right? It's a big enough weakness that you can blow up the Death Star because the president is weak on the economy, and that's the most important thing to Americans. 2, the Republicans, the party, Mitt Romney, and their affiliated center-right conservative groups will outraise Obama, and that is the first time in American presidential history that an incumbent will be at a financial disadvantage. That has never happened before. There's a Supreme Court ruling and a bunch of reasons for this. But the bottom line is the Republicans actually have a slight financial advantage. I don't think it's enough to guarantee them the election. I think Romney has enough money to win but not guarantee his election. I think the president has enough money to win but not guarantee his election. Money isn't going to decide this issue. But 4 years ago, McCain, for example, was severely underfunded against Obama. It really put him at a disadvantage. And the president doesn't have that overwhelming advantage like he had against John McCain. Voter ID efforts, we can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A. There has been some attempt to restrict ballot access to people who don't have government voter ID, which is basically a driver's license. And those people tend to be younger voters, non-white, and poor people who use public transportation. And most cynics agree that this is an effort by conservatives and Republicans to keep the voters who vote Democratic away from the ballot box. Low Democratic enthusiasm. This used to be a much bigger advantage for the Republicans because going into the summer before the conventions, there was a huge gap between Republicans who said we're enthusiastic about voting this fall and Democrats who said. 4 years ago, in 2008, Democrats had a huge enthusiasm gap. Everybody was ready for the end of the Bush administration. Everybody was excited about this interesting new hope and change, half black, half white candidate. Democratic enthusiasm was through the roof, Republican enthusiasm was low. This year it's the other way around, and the gap used to be really big, but it's come back a little bit for the Democrats after the convention. Bill Clinton's speech and Michelle Obama's speech, Democrats have come back to Barack Obama in the last couple of months. And so it's still an advantage for Romney Ryan, but it's not the advantage it was even 6 weeks ago. And lastly, the stability of the electoral map, which I just put over there. You must say, well, geez, it has a typo here. Right? How can it be an advantage that favors Obama and favors Romney? It's still a bigger advantage for the incumbent because he won the last election. You still got to loosen the map. But as I pointed out from the beginning, the fact that Romney, no matter what he does, is starting with 180 electoral votes means he's within range no matter what. He's within range no matter what. It's like starting a sprint, a 100-yard dash or a 100-meter dash, and you put both candidates at the 90-yard mark. You still got a chance to beat the guy. Right? It's not like the faster guy. If you're the faster guy, you want a 100-yard dash, right? You want a wide distance so you can show that you're a better racer. But if you're not the better racer and you're both starting pretty close to the finish line, you could beat Obama quickly, maybe a last-minute bad debate performance. You might be seeing in real time a situation where because Romney's starting with 180 or 190 electoral votes, if at the last minute a bunch of voters defect from Obama, Romney can sort of steal this race that Obama's been leading really for 8-9 months now. Here is the Huffington Post. There are a lot of sites that sort of aggregate where are the states right now based on state polls. And you can see Obama's pretty close, 253 locked in electoral votes. He really only needs to win Ohio or a couple of small states, and he'll be at 270. Romney's about 50 electoral votes behind. Romney really needs, of these 79 toss-up states, the states that aren't blue or red, he really needs to win most of them. Not all of them, but most of them. That's why I say Obama still has an overall advantage in the state polls, because it's a series of statewide elections. And that's, I think, a pretty good depiction. I think Obama will win probably half of those 79 electoral votes. So add 40, 45, and Obama will be around 300, maybe it'll be 310, maybe it'll be at 290, enough to win. And Romney will finish up a little shy, 250, 260, something like that, maybe 240. There are scenarios, like I said, where I think Romney can win. We'll see what happens in the next 3 weeks. But if I had to bet my career and reputation on it, I would put my money on the incumbent for the moment. So there you go. It was a very predictable election. We knew who the tickets were going to be. We knew what the electoral map was going to look like and what the demographic patterns of the voters in that map. We know that incumbents historically win. I believe Obama will beat Romney by about 2, 3, 4 points. There are scenarios, I suppose, where Romney collapses and Obama wins by a wide margin. I don't think that'll happen. And there are scenarios where Obama fails and Romney wins by 1 or 2 points. I don't think that will happen. I'll put Obama at somewhere on the low end, 290 electoral votes, maybe on the high end, 340. I think 6 or fewer states will flip. In other words, the map that I showed you at the beginning of this lecture is pretty much the map you'll see it. In fact, if you look at this map, right, it looks like the map I showed you at the start of the election, right? You color a couple of these states in blue, and you color a couple of these states in red, and it's the same map. very few states will change. Remember, only 3 changed between 2000 and 2004, and only 9 changed between 2004 and 2008, including an overlap of 2. So I put the number of states that changed somewhere between 3 and 9. I'll put it right at about 6 max. And that doesn't really favor Romney. Romney really needs to shake up the map a lot. And as I predicted, the Republicans will hold their majority in the House, and the Democrats will hold their majority in the Senate. And if that's true, it doesn't matter if Romney or Obama wins, because we'll have divided government again for 2 more years, right? If the Congress is divided, Republicans in the House and Democrats in the Senate, it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, we will have a non-unified party government in Washington for 2013 and 2014. And guess what? In the last 60 years, from 1952 to 2012, in 60 years of government, how many years have we had unified government? 20, just 1/3 of the time. So we will continue to have partisan gridlock, we will continue to have polarization in both the elites and the masses, we will continue to have the inability of the US government to solve its long-term intractable problems, whether it's foreign policy issues or domestic issues. And so look for 2 more years of very stalemated, partisan bickering government. I don't see a status quo change in any of that either. Thanks.
All right. So many thanks for this very comprehensive talk, very fast pace in the presentation. But I mean, there was a lot to cover, and I guess even though you got 20% of the whole lecture, I guess it's pretty good. I have very low expectations, so I'm okay with that. So we will open the floor to the questions. I have one from David. Students also don't hesitate. This is quite a unique opportunity to have a specialist of American politics answering your questions. Right? So I'll start with the staff, but I would prefer to start with the students. I'll start with the staff. Anyway, so David, go ahead.
I didn't hear the most important word. What is it? Ecology. Why is ecology a non-issue this time? If the planet disappears, what's the point between red and blue? No one seems to be concerned about that in the U.S.
It takes a second all the way up.
Green? Okay. I mean, the environment, when you poll people in terms of what's important, and this is what they told Al Gore, the great environmentalist candidate. His own advisor said, if you talk about the environment, it's only cared about by a sliver of the public. People much more concerned about jobs and growth and whether the pollution that's created from those jobs is doing long-term detrimental damage to the planet. Now, increasingly, American attitudes are changing on the reality of climate change and the man-made contributions to climate change. But in the short term, a good half of the country doesn't care about that. And the other half of the country that does care still has to counterbalance that with, are we going to develop coal, and are we going to continue to develop fossil fuels, and all sorts of things like that. So, I mean, you're right, in the long term, if George Bush is right, we'll all be dead, right? From economic or ecological degradation, but it's not an issue that polls very strongly as moving voters, except for a very small sliver of environmental voters who are mostly would vote for Nader or somebody like that, but tend to, even if begrudgingly, they vote for the Democratic Party, which they view as stronger. And I think it's fair to say the Democratic Party is stronger. Obama believes in clean coal technology, wind and solar, at a stronger level than Romney does. But not by that much. Both candidates are very, Obama comes from a big nuclear power state, Illinois, and they are very similar on that issue. I mean, the big differences here is that you have a climate change denier in Romney, and conservatives like the Koch brothers and stuff who put up a lot of money into the Republican campaign, they're climate change deniers. So there is a significant difference between the two parties there. But in terms of everyday policy, no, not that much difference. I mean, Obama has been talking about cap and trade and capping our carbon emissions, and that'll never get through because there are some Democrats from automaking states and coal states who won't support, and that's more than enough opposition with the Republicans to block any kind of cap and trade plan. And you know, in defense of those who oppose it, you may disagree with me here, it's hard to unilaterally solve these problems on a global basis, right? You really need, this is a perfect example where the commons really is the entire globe. You need to have a common solution that's solved on an international treaty basis, because it doesn't make sense for one country to unilaterally do this if other countries continue to just burn carbon and fossil fuels and advance faster in terms of economic development. We really need a global solution, and we really need global leadership on this, but I don't see that coming. That's not to excuse American policy on this, but there are substantial differences between the two-party coalitions on this. Most environmental groups endorse Obama and Democrats generally. But Obama right now, politically, if I'm right, if he wins by a smaller margin, is he going to have the political capital to do anything about that at a time when unemployment is 8% and effective unemployment, including the long-term unemployed, is closer to 18 or 20%? People don't want to hear those messages when they can't feed their kids and buy braces and new shoes and a winter coat. That's the last thing that they want to hear. So you haven't, Obama's targeting signals to environmental voters who care about this, but in terms of the macro debate, you're not hearing that much from the Democrats, and you darn sure won't hear anything from the Republicans because their constituency believes in drilling more for fossil fuels and oil and coal and natural gas. Well, I don't mean to be cynical, but you want my honest answer, and that's the honest answer.
Further to that, on that, is there any space for long-term policy making debate in a presidential campaign in the US? Is it a killer for a candidate to bring that up? Because it requires sophistication, it requires time, a lot of explanation, raising awareness and all that, which is not the timing really of an election where everything is snappy and all that. So
right, and you need little pet phrases that motivate people. If you listen to what Democrats and Obama say on this, they usually defend their environmental policies by couching them in economic development. They say, look, if we go to clean coal technology, and if we go to wind and solar and other alternative fuels, it will create X number of jobs. So they understand that they can only sell it when they link it to job creation, and that as soon as Americans view ecological protection as a threat to job growth and GDP growth, then they don't want to make that trade-off. So Obama, and there's truth to this, there are millions of green jobs that can be created, but that's the only way it can be sold. It has to be sold under the cloak, right? It has to be disguised under the guise of this is economic development that also has the side benefit of being green friendly. But selling it as green friendly only is, and you can blame the American public if you want, there's plenty of us, to blame. The American public does not want to be sold a green bill of goods as only a green bill of goods. They care more about the green that's on the dollar than the green that you're walking on.
Other questions? Emily?
Thank you very much first for your very interesting talk.
Sorry I went so fast. I'm told that maybe my English is a little too fast. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
We have taped it, and the PowerPoint will be also on the website, right? So if you're interested in the PowerPoint, it will be on the website.
Sorry.
I have two questions, one pertaining to xenophobia and how it is divided in the US, and the other one, what would that change in terms of foreign policy in Asia and in the South China Sea?
I don't foresee, to answer your second question first, I don't foresee any real difference in the posture of the United States toward this hemisphere or to the South China Sea or China specifically or the government of China if Romney or Obama wins. What we know about American voters and their view of foreign policy vis-a-vis or international relations vis-a-vis China are two things that we know from polling results. One is that Americans are anxious about the fact that China is going to surpass the United States in the next generation in terms of total GDP. And that creates a bit of anxiety. We've been the largest economy since the start of the First World War, and we'll go about 100 years before we fall in the second. Now we'll be way ahead in terms of GDP per capita. You've got 1 billion extra people sharing that wealth, and we do. We're about 300 million, and you guys are about 1.3, 1.4 billion, something like that. What's the total population of China?
1.3.
1.3. Yeah, we're 300 million and change. So you got 1 billion more people. So the day you tie us, you'll still be 1/4 of the GDP per capita that we are. The second thing that we know from polls is that Americans are hypersensitive to and overestimate the share of debt, outstanding U.S. debt that's held by the Chinese. How much of the outstanding U.S. debt is Chinese held? Does anybody know?
23? Is it 23?
No, it's not 23, less. It's like Bob Barker's like a game show. Put your bids in. It's about 9 or 10%. American debt is in basically 3 equal chunks. The first is held domestically. It's institutional investors and individual bondholders who get treasury bonds, buy treasury bonds. That's about 1/3 of our debt. 1/3 of American debt is owed to the American population itself. The government and the Federal Reserve and our long-term pension plans, Medicare, Social Security, the pensions of federal workers, the pension of military, which is a subset, are in surplus right now. The receipts from those pension contributions exceed the health care and retirement benefits of the military, other federal workers, and Americans who are entitled to Social Security and Medicare. That's why Gore was always talking about the lockbox. He said we shouldn't use this money to pay our operating budget. But almost every economist says it makes more sense to give the money to yourself than to borrow and pay interest on it. That doesn't make any sense. So 1/3 of U.S. debt is held by the U.S. itself, by the U.S. government, pensioners. And 1/3 of the debt is held by foreign holders, foreign creditors, and of that third, about a third is China. China's the #1 foreign holder of our debt, but they have about a third of our third foreign held debt, and so a third is what? 1, 9, 11, 10, 9, 11%, roughly. I think Brazil is second, or the Dutch maybe, the British in Brazil, or some sort of order like that. So yes, the percentage of Chinese held new debt is higher than 11% because there's a lot more Chinese debt holding now than 20, 30 years ago. But Americans are sensitive to the notion, and you hear Romney was tapping into that in the debates. He was saying we shouldn't be borrowing money from the Chinese to pay for things we can't afford and haven't saved money for, or budgeted for, or are overspending on. And there's clearly, they're trying to tap into this anxiety that exists. I don't want to say it's, I don't want to say it's fear-mongering, because I don't think it's to that level. There's not people calling for, revolt against our Chinese creditors, or let's invade China, because that's what happens sometimes when countries owe money, they just take you over, right? You're not hearing that kind of, but it's this sort of nervousness about China's growth and China being a lender, that they're making products and we're buying it from Chinese and they're lending us the money to buy it. They're basically giving us these goods on loan, hoping to, eventually get debt. But, right now, look at the US, the Federal Reserve rate is basically near zero. I mean, people are lending the United States money at 0%. In fact, in some cases, do you know that there are negative bond rates in Europe right now? That Germans are getting paid to lend people money. There are negative bond rates right now. People are so nervous, they're willing to give $100 in exchange for a guarantee of $99.50 next year. We have negative bond rates in Europe right now. So the argument is, you gotta be careful, we can't do this forever. If people start jacking up the interest rates, if you have a debt ceiling crisis and the Standard & Poor's credit rating in the United States falls, boy, then suddenly people want to lend us money at Greece, and not quite Greece or Ireland or Iceland or Spanish rates. We're not to that point. But if you can grow at 2% and people are going to lend you money at 0%, why would you do it? So, the economic leaders of both parties recognize that the money is still cheap right now, but that may not be forever. But that's what Romney's tapping into. And by the way, it's not just Republicans doing that. If you remember, I don't know if you paid close attention, Hillary Clinton in the 2008 race against Obama in the primary talked a lot about, we can't fight back against it, you can't tell your banker what to do, referring to the Chinese. Refer to the Chinese as America's banker. So it's clear that politicians know these poll numbers. I know them, they know them, right? They're doing focus groups. And they know that there is some political gain to be made by playing a little bit on this xenophobia among Americans that, hey, we're losing our hegemony, or America's in decline, and the reason is the Chinese. So let's do something about that. Let's stop borrowing money from them. Let's force them to have better trade practices and labor protections and environmental protections, or we're not going to trade in the trade imbalance. So there is this fear, and fear is a powerful motivator that politicians of both stripes, Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney, know you can win some votes on. And so it's strategic politically to talk that kind of talk. But in the end, is Romney going to do much different? I mean, he talks about currency manipulation. He's talking about that in the election. What's he going to do about it after the election? Nothing.
Yeah, we actually just touched on this a little bit, but can you give some more examples of what distinguished the two candidates in terms of foreign policy?
Not much. I mean, if you look at Romney, what has he said on Afghanistan? He would have held the surge troops that Obama just took out. These are the additional troops that Obama, by the way, I think he's done a bad job in Afghanistan. I'm here on behalf of the State Department. These opinions are my own. I just criticized the current Secretary of State who paid for my lunch and my hotel room, right? I thought that was a little bit of, xenophobia that she was trafficking in against Obama in 2008. My politics, if you read my columns, are no mystery. I'm a liberal Democrat, and I supported Obama over Hillary Clinton, and of course Obama in the general election. But, on the foreign policy side, okay, so Romney says he would have kept the surge troops in until December instead of September. Whoa. He doesn't want to re-engage in Iraq. He supports the president's decision to end the war in Iraq. He supports the president's timetable on the eventual withdrawal of military troops from Afghanistan in 2014. So there's no real difference there. On Israel, Iran, Syria, you hear Romney, rattling the saber. We need to be stronger about Iran. You heard Paul Ryan making this argument like, we need to have stronger sanctions. And then Biden's like, here's all our sanctions. There are stronger sanctions against Iran today than when Bush left office. So short of a war, remember Biden said, short of starting a war, what is it you would like us to do that we haven't done? And Paul Ryan was silent. So there's really not much difference between the parties, parties generally. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about like the Nader wing or the Buchanan wing of the Republican Party or Ron Paul. I'm talking about mainstream Republican Council of Foreign Relations viewpoints and the Democrats. Not much difference light on Israel. Both parties support our longstanding relationship with our closest ally, democracy in the Middle East. They both want Jerusalem to be the eventual capital and the location of the U.S. Embassy. Both candidates say that. They both believe, at least in talk, about a two-party state solution. Is Romney a little bit more closer to Likud? Is he a little bit trying to cozy up to Netanyahu? Or they've been teasing Obama about not meeting with Bibi Netanyahu? Sure. But, you know, when those Israeli troops were going to be stuck in Cairo, Netanyahu called Obama and he got him out and he said, we owe a great debt of thanks to the American president. And if Al Gore had been president, or George Bush, or John McCain, we would have done this exact same thing. U.S. policy barely moves on Israel and Iran. What else? China, I already told you. I mean, these are the only real three areas where there's a lot of any kind of discussion or any kind of political impact on the election. So, but that's also true historically. There's far less differences between the mainstream of the two major parties on foreign policy than domestic policy. It's domestic policy, taxes, Obamacare, environmental a little bit, abortion, contraception, gay marriage. That's where there's differences between the two parties.
Right. We have the time for one last question. Anybody?
One student, come on.
Here's one. We had one.
Staff.
No, we had one student.
We did?
I don't know.
Should I call on a student? I call on my own students. I'm going to pick somebody randomly. How about that?
Sorry.
Can I pick somebody randomly?
That's a tough one.
No? Come on, one student.
David, you're still a student.
This gentleman wants to ask a question. This gentleman, over his.
James, you have a question? If you don't want to go for a question, don't go for a question. I hear this.
I'm sorry? Let's speak up a bit. In Romney's speeches, yeah. Yeah, the question is sort of a follow-up to the woman's question over here, which is Romney's rattling the saber and calling China a currency manipulator, and that he would sort of put his foot down. I mean, let's take Romney at face value that he really means it and he's trying to differentiate himself from Obama. He views Obama as more accommodationist to China. Let's take that at face value that he really means it and that he really do something about it. I don't believe it, but just for the sake of argument. What does that mean? Well, I don't know, maybe he would try to renegotiate trade situations, or maybe he would strongly encourage American businesses and American consumers not to import Chinese goods. Are we not going to borrow money from Chinese lenders? What's he really going to do about it? I mean, he can only, I think, change the policy at the margins. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm happy to be corrected on this point. I think it's mostly for effect. And in fact, and I'm not the only person that views this, so you can discount what I say. If you look at Romney's foreign policy speeches, he gave a big one last week, he gave a big one back to the Citadel in October of 2011 before the Republican primaries. What is his criticism of Obama? It's not specific policy points. It's mostly that Obama's an apologist, that he's weak, that he doesn't appreciate that America's unique role in the world. He doesn't appreciate American exceptionalism. He doesn't believe in our unique role to be sort of policeman and controller of the world and role model. It's mostly thematic, right? It's mostly optics. It's mostly rhetoric. There's not a lot of substantial points on which you could say, Obama is doing this and I will do this differently. Romney is mostly making a critique about Obama's posture and about his strength or his weakness in Romney's view. And that's because Romney doesn't really want to differentiate from Obama. There's no advantage for him to differentiate on a president who's net positive on foreign policy, killed Osama bin Laden, and ended the most unpopular war in American history. Romney's job is basically just to draw no distinction between him and the president on foreign policy so that people can focus on the distinctions on domestic and economic policy, because that's where he's going to win the election. So, all due respect, and I hear what he's saying, I think it's mostly a lot of rhetorical bluster with no real policy difference afterwards if he gets elected on day one.
All right, we need to wrap it up in 3
questions.
minutes. So, you want one? Last one?
David, you already asked. We need to wrap it up in 3 minutes. So. Yeah, I have to do a media interview after, sorry.
Well, I don't know, but I would like to have a word from you about Obama's foreign policy. He promises to end Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
Afghanistan war, containment Iraq. We have this Arab uprising, and we don't know very well where the United States are. So how can you judge, evaluate Obama's foreign policy?
Well, I think when Obama was running for president in 2008, to sort of link in the Afghanistan part, I think the president was worried about looking weak, having opposed the Iraq war. He knew he could win the election because, and he won the nomination, by the way, by differentiating himself from Hillary Clinton, right? He used the fact that Hillary Clinton voted for the Iraq war as a way of differentiating himself with liberal voters in the primary. If Hillary Clinton had voted against the war, I think she would have been the nominee and the president. Obama needed to show that he was right, correct on the Iraq war in the eyes of history. But he also, I think, overcompensated for that by projecting that he would take the fight to the people who attacked us, to use his language. And so Obama promised an Iraq-style surge in Afghanistan. Now, I don't know if that's worked very well. You can ask different people. There's different assessments of how well that 25 or 30,000 troops that he sent to Afghanistan. It took him about 14, first of all, it took him 14 months to come up with a policy. And Republican or conservative critics or media critics of Obama's hemming and hawing, I think, are spot on. I think the president did not know what to do, and he did not want to make a decision on delivering that. Number two is, I think he probably overpromised an Afghanistan solution to show voters in the general election after he had beaten Hillary Clinton that he wasn't just going to withdraw all our troops from all parts of the world, that he was for the ending of the Iraq war military presence, and he opposed the war. He wasn't even a senator yet, but he had public statements in 2002. And I think it's safe to argue, and I remember I voted for him, that he overcompensated a little bit and overpromised on Afghanistan and then felt he had to deliver, and now he's drawing down that surge, and the violence rates and the death and fatality rates in Afghanistan in parts of last year were equal to what they were in Iraq at certain points. And this is America's forgotten war. I mean, people do not want to talk about Iraq, or Afghanistan. Americans want to pretend that that war isn't even going on. We have a spate of stories in the United States, the forgotten war, the ignored war. Americans don't want to pretend it's not even happening. So you could argue that Obama had a policy failure from the campaign to the first year when he hemmed and hawed, to the execution, to the withdrawal of the surge. And I'm not trying to just mimic Romney's points, but Romney isn't arguing for a resurge in Afghanistan either. So there's somewhat of an intractable problem there. On the other stuff, which was it you said? Oh yeah, Guantanamo. I mean, liberals are very unhappy with Obama on issues like, particularly two issues, Guantanamo and drone missiles. But Obama is being very strategic on both cases. The American public doesn't have a problem with either of those. I'm not saying we have an appetite for it, but when you look at polls, Americans are not concerned with the warehousing of potential terrorists or actual terrorists in Guantanamo. And by pretty significant margins, 60–65%, Americans approve of the use of drone missiles. And the irony here is that in the wake of Iraq, and to a lesser degree Afghanistan, in the wake of the neoconservative preemptive, let's send boots on the ground, Americans' taste for pushing a button in Langley, Virginia at the CIA headquarters to kill somebody is actually higher than it would be otherwise in the absence of that very costly war. And so Obama is being criticized by liberals as acting either unconstitutional or at the very least immoral. And I would agree with them. I think killing an American citizen with a drone missile is amoral. And it's certainly, if it's not that, it's unconstitutional. Even if that person is a known terrorist, they're entitled to a trial, not a trial by fire, right? Not a trial by Death Star shot. And I'm criticizing the President of the United States right now, right? And liberals are very unhappy with that. But if you look at the overall public, that's the smart play, because Americans are much more happy with how President Obama handled not the recent killings, but handled the Libyan uprising than Bush handled the Iraqi problem, right? When Romney and the Republicans said, Obama, that phrase got leaked out, that Obama was happy to lead from behind, and Romney kicked in and he said, see, he's weak, he's an apologist, he doesn't know how to use American strength. And what did the president turn around and say? He said it cost us $1 billion instead of $1 trillion, and no lies. And that was a direct critique of the Bush approach, which that war in Iraq cost us 5,000 soldiers, 25,000 non-fatal casualties, and eventually long-term in disability and healthcare, will cost us $2 to $3 trillion, according to Joseph Stiglitz. That's a $2 trillion war to foment a non-executed revolution in Iraq. And Obama's point is, we sent troops and joined our allies, we did not send troops, excuse me, supported our allies, spent $1 billion instead of $2 trillion, and we got the same result. And that's what Americans want. Americans do not want right now, they do not have a taste for interventionist foreign policy, and that means Guantanamo and drone missiles, and so I'm sorry to give you that answer, but it's true.
All right, so many thanks, Dr. Chandler, and we hope to have you back another time, maybe after the election. For the next election, so in 4 years' time at least. So let's give Professor Chandler one last round of applause, and let's meet up.